Welcome to the Accessing Genetic Memory Through Tarot online independent study course. After this lecture on the theoretical premise behind genetic memory recall by using the tarot as the triggering event, we'll be working through card reading techniques for connecting with ancestors. Then we'll get into past life tarot readings. Before we start, let's get a lay of the land. Here's the outline of what we'll be covering. First, the theoretical science of genetic memory. We'll then reconcile biology and psychology. From there, how do we use the tarot as a catalyst for an altered state of consciousness? Specifically, we'll compare and contrast genetic memory with mediumship. To help you approach your own readings, we'll cover a few case studies to help with your interpretive method. After the cut and dry overview, we'll begin the guided reading part of the workshop. The first part will be learning how to use your tarot cards for accessing ancestral memory. Then we'll go back to lecture to prepare ourselves for the past life reading method, approaching the theory and metaphor of a past life reading. Then the second guided reading in this workshop will be to access past life memory. For those reading the cards professionally, I'll cover some of my tips for doing ancestral and past life readings for others before concluding with some closing remarks on this rather niche and intense way of using your cards. Let's start with the question, what is memory? How can we bridge what we know about memory and consciousness in psychology with neurology? The short answer to what memory is from a neurological standpoint is the activation and reactivation of specific ensembles or groupings of neurons in your brain. The first time you perceive something, whether that's an experience or an emotion, an ensemble of neurons in your brain gets activated. Then, when a strikingly similar experience or emotion occurs again, they induce that same ensemble or grouping of neurons to be reactivated. That's memory recall. For example, the first time you watch through this video, your brain is encoding certain neurons with data, much like a computer saving input of information into its drive. If and when you watch this video again, or even when you experience something strikingly similar to the information presented here, those same groupings of neurons are reactivated, and the same exact pathways are encoded yet again. Third time, same pathways encoded again. Fourth time, again, the same pathways are being inscribed into the neuron, driving that pathway deeper and deeper.
When you think negative self-defeating thoughts, the process of thinking that thought encodes your neurons. There is a physical neurological event happening. Your neuron changes. It gets inscribed with a pathway of encoding per that negative self-defeating thought. If and when you think the same exact negative self-defeating thought again, the same pathway you previously created is recreated or reactivated, and the pathway is encoded or etched into your neuron deeper and deeper. The ninth, 10th, and the multiple times you think that same exact thought, it is so much easier to go straight to that pathway and get stuck in it because of how deep that etching or encoding has become in your neuron. It becomes your subjective reality, the way you perceive the world. Here's how a neuroscientist explained it to me. You think a thought for the first time, a pathway in your neurons is created. It actually takes some work for you to rethink that same thought, to retrace the pathway a second time. But repeated revisitations of that same pathway is going to drive the encoding deeper and deeper into a deeper groove so that it becomes really, really easy to go straight to that thought. The same is true for the opposite, for repeated positive, uplifting thoughts. This is also why when you repeat study of something, your memory recall or memory retention is much stronger.
So here's what we understand today about memory. It's a binary event. The first component of memory is synapses. Memories are stored in synapses or juncture points between our cells. Basically, a synapses is a bridge or a tunnel that allows a neuron, a nerve cell, to send an electrical or chemical signal to another neuron, and these signals are what spark our memories. The second component of memory is nuclear DNA. What you see on screen to the right is a representation of a neuron. There's a nucleus inside that neuron, and that nucleus contains genetic material, chromosomes, in other words, our genes.
While most of these cells in our bodies cycle in and out and have pretty short lifespans, neurons are the oldest cells in your body. Some of the neurons you have right now, you had at birth, before birth even. Yes, neurons can die, and unlike other cells, they can't readily be replaced. I say readily because in 1998, we did discover that the brain can in fact grow new neurons in the hippocampus, and this might prove the long-term benefits of meditation, but that's getting way off tangent.
Here's what we are now learning in neuroscience about memory. Remember, not only is memory synapses, meaning the firing of pathways in your brain, but memory is also encoded on the genetic level inside the nucleus of your neuron. So memories and perception physically change your chromosomes. Your genes can mutate as a result of your environment and your personal experiences. Those experiences not only get encoded into your memory, but that memory mutates your genes. There are 20,000 genes that make up the human genome, which are active or expressed in the brain. These genes impact how your brain develops and functions, which impact how you think, feel, and behave. Science is only beginning to understand how personalities are inherited from one generation to the next through this study of memory, experiences, and genes.
Physiologically, this can relate to the inheritance of diseases and even mental illnesses such as schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and other mood disorders found to be genetic and carried on in our genes from generation to generation. There are several major studies on intergenerational trauma as a result of the Holocaust, where the grandchildren, so one whole generation removed of those who went through the Holocaust, exhibit psychological signs of trauma similar to those who personally and directly would have experienced such a traumatic event. These grandchildren's personalities and behavior are changed by what their grandparents went through. Now there are a lot of both psychological and neurological studies on this, and I want to make it clear we don't have a scientifically proven explanation, but we do have one theory that fascinates me. One theory is the trauma the Holocaust was so profound that it mutated those grandparents' genes, and so they passed those genes, that genetic memory, down to their grandchildren. So even though the grandchildren did not personally go through that trauma, they exhibit signs of that trauma because of the genetic memory they inherited. Let's talk about that.
We now understand that memory gets encoded into genetic material by way of mitosis or meiosis. You inherit genes, right? Well, those genes contain genetic memory. You inherit the memories that got encoded, etched most deeply into the neurons of your parents, grandparents, and ancestral lines. It gets embedded into your unconscious, and now we're bridging neuroscience and psychology. So you possess these memories in the absence of personal direct sensory experience. That's why we have this prevailing theory now that you can inherit trauma or even phobias from your forebears. So if a grandmother or great grandfather went through a traumatic war, we can inherit certain personality traits associated with someone who has been through a war, even though we ourselves have not. Carl Jung theorized that we are born with the memories and experiences of our ancestors imprinted into our DNA. Quick refresher of junior high biology class for anyone who needs it. Chromosomes are DNA molecules. When I say chromosomes, I'm talking about genetic material. You remember asexual reproduction, right? Mitosis happens when your chromosomes separate through divisions of the nucleus. Memory recorded in that genetic material is passed on and inherited through cell division or mitosis. Meiosis is two rounds of that cell division, which is what creates sperm cells and egg cells, which, by the way, kind of reminds me of geomancy, doesn't it? The mother figures become the daughter figures. This idea of a genetic or cellular memory could explain evolutionary biology. The adaptive changes we see in a species could be a direct result of that encoded genetic memory in our DNA. So now we've established that epigeneticists theorize that you mutate your own genes when you experience trauma, and then you pass those mutated or encoded genes with cellular memory on to future generations. A lot of your personality traits, why you behave the way you do, is a result of what's in your DNA, which you inherited from your ancestors. Your DNA contains ancestral memory, which is what causes you to tick the way you do. Here's the hypothesis I'm basing my explanation for psychic connections to ancestral memory. It's in your genes. All you're doing is memory recall. The same way you try to recollect what you did yesterday or what your childhood was like, you are going to reach further, deeper into your unconscious memory to recollect what your ancestors did.
On one hand, genetic memory accounts for Carl Jung's concept of a collective unconscious. On the other, in population genetics and evolutionary biology, our genetic memory accounts for the recorded history of adaptive changes in our species. So perhaps our genes can account for what we inherit from our ancestors beyond physiology, but psychically, our psychic connection to our ancestors happens when we tap into our latent genetic memory.
Fun researched trivia: 50% of your positive emotions come from your genes. In other words, allegedly, happiness is genetic. A 2005 Stanford University study and also a 2017 study by the University of Amsterdam from a sampling of 300,000 people found that a person's level of happiness is linked to your genetic makeup. Three genetic variants account for happiness: two for depression and 11 for different degrees of neurotic behavior. Bridging neuroscience with psychology, genetic memory accounts for the Jungian concept of the collective unconscious. So, what I believe or speculate we're doing when we access ancestral memory is we're accessing our unconscious. The neurological phrasing for it would be your genetic memory, and the psychological phrasing of it would be your unconscious memory or knowledge. By the way, I just want to emphasize that a lot of what's being researched and studied right now on cellular memory is still speculative. As advanced as we think we are, we still know so very, very little about how our brain works. Both the psychology and the neurology are still occult to us. I think a few definitions are also in order. What do I mean when I refer to the subconscious? I mean the part of our consciousness that we are not actively aware of, but that influence our behavior, your personality, and even the way you think. Subconscious memory compels your behavior and how or why you react to stimuli the way you do. I'll put that on screen nice and big for you to see. There you go. The part of our consciousness that we are not actively aware of, but that influence our behavior, personality, and thoughts. And when we talk about our unconscious, we're referring to processes of the mind that's automated. It's inaccessible to you, normally speaking, because it's repressed or blocked or it wasn't yours. You did not acquire it. This is that genetic memory I've been talking about, your ancestral memory. Once again, nice and big on screen for the nerdy ones who want to write it down for whatever reason. You can pause the video here if you need more time. Processes in the mind that occur automatically, that influence impulses and motivations in a way that is inaccessible to the conscious mind because it has been repressed. This definition for the subconscious comes from Pierre Janet, and the definition for the unconscious that we're working with is attributed to Friedrich Schelling. Subconscious memory is considered somewhat accessible with enough self reflection and introspection, or with the help of a therapist. You can bring to recall or self awareness of what's in your subconscious memory. But memory in the unconscious is not accessible to you through ordinary thought processes. Just because you reflect and journal hard doesn't mean you can access it. Rather, to recall unconscious memory, there needs to be a catalyst or trigger. And that's where I propose that the tarot comes into use. We can use these cards to trigger retrieval of genetic memory, ancestral memory from your unconscious reserves. Let's review the pyramid of encoded memory. Conscious memory is encoded first-hand perception. It's what you perceive, whether you've experienced it, was an eyewitness, heard about it, read about it, you perceived it in some way. So you're aware of this encoding. Subconscious memory is how you perceive the world in a more intuitive, impulsive way. When you're using the tarot as a tool for self-reflection or as journaling prompts, you can use the cards to access subconscious memory. You can reflect on why you do what you do. As you go through life, you're encoding your neurons with conscious and subconscious memory and transmuting those neurons, mutating your hard drive. Through meiosis or reproduction, we then pass that mutated hard drive or encoded memory onto our offspring, and what was our conscious and subconscious becomes part of the offspring's unconscious memory, genetic memory. One notable way to trigger access to unconscious memory is through ASC, or Altered State of Consciousness. The purpose of ASC is to provide an alternate pattern of perception. So you're forcing your mind to go in a different pathway or synapses of neurons than what it's used to. So it won't resort to conscious memory. It'll go off script, go off the beaten path, and maybe, hopefully, wander into unconscious territory. To achieve that, you need to produce a profound change in your subjective reality or subjective experience. Meditation is a powerful trigger. Hypnosis is another. ASMR, or I will neither judge nor encourage the last one, but there's also pharmacological manipulation. This is why in so many different cultures and mystical traditions, shamans use herbs in their rituals that change your mental state. Ayahuasca, for example, or African dream root, mugwort, the datura plant. Those are just a few examples of what we call onerogens, herbs that induce a dream-like state of consciousness.
I believe when we ritualize tarot, that ritualized modality of tarot induces an altered state of consciousness where you start to receive revelations or access to your unconscious memory. Now, we went through all of that boring science or maybe pseudoscience part because it does give you an important framework for beginning to think about how you can curate that altered state of consciousness for yourself through tarot cards.
In this video, I want to end on a note about genetic memory versus mediumship. I do believe when we access these spirit connections, or that's what we're calling it, genetic memory and mediumship are related, but they're different processes and using different paradigms, though we are getting the same outcome.
I think, and these are just my very personal opinionated thoughts, that mediumship is access outward. You're reaching outward with your mind on the presumption that there is a collective unconscious. So we're psychically connected to everything, all of space time in a fluid, nonlinear continuum. What I'm trying to demonstrate in this course is access of genetic memory reaching inward with your mind on the presumption that the experiences of your ancestors are encoded into your genes, that the same way you perform memory recall to recollect what you did yesterday, you can perform memory recall to recollect your ancestors. Now that we got the research presentation out of the way, let's learn how to sling some cards.